My name is Darcy Callahan. I am 29 years old, and on Thanksgiving night, my mother stood up at the head of the table, raised her glass, and thanked every single person in the room for making the family what it was. She thanked my father for his steadiness. She thanked my older sister Vanessa for carrying on the family name with grace. She thanked Vanessa's husband Marcus for being the son she never had. She even thanked the caterer by name. Then she sat down. I was sitting 3 chairs away. Between a cousin I barely knew and an empty seat no one had bothered to remove. My wine was untouched. My plate was already cold. I kept waiting for the correction, the little laugh, the oh, and of course, Darcy. It never came. My father caught my eye for half a second, looked away, and started cutting his turkey. Vanessa smiled at me from across the table, not with warmth but with satisfaction, the way someone smiles when a point has been made and received. After dinner, I helped clear plates because that is what I had always done. My mother passed me in the kitchen doorway and said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "Darcy, honestly, I forget you're here half the time. You blend into the background so well it's almost a talent." She laughed. Vanessa laughed from the dining room. My father said nothing. I put down the plates. I picked up my coat. And I drove home in silence. So heavy. It felt like a passenger. 11 days later, on a Monday morning at 9 a.m., my mother opened an envelope that had been couriered to her real estate office. She read the first paragraph and called my father. My father read it and called Vanessa. Vanessa read it and threw her phone across the room. By noon, all three of them had tried to reach me. I know this because I watched every call come in and let every single one go to voicemail. Before I tell you what was in that envelope and what happened after Thanksgiving, tell me something. What time is it where you are right now? And where in the world are you watching from? I always like to know how far a story like this can travel. The reason Thanksgiving cut the way it did was not because I needed a toast. It was because that dinner finally made visible what had been true for years. I was not overlooked. I was managed. There is a difference between forgetting someone and training a room to act like they are not there. My family lived in Charleston, South Carolina. My father, Glenn Callahan, ran a commercial property management company called Callahan Properties. Nothing enormous, but respectable. 14 buildings across the Lowcountry, a mix of retail and office space, mostly inherited from my grandfather, and expanded by my father in the early 2000s, when downtown Charleston was still undervalued. My mother, Irene, was a licensed broker who handled the leasing side. She liked people to know she worked, but she liked them to know she did not have to even more. Vanessa was the golden child, not because she had accomplished more, but because she had married well and looked the part. Marcus came from a family that owned a chain of orthopedic clinics across 3 states. Their wedding had been in a historic garden with 200 guests and a string quartet. My mother still kept the photos on the mantle like a shrine to the life she wanted people to believe we all lived. And then there was me. I had gone to law school, not the prestigious kind my family could brag about at dinner parties, but a solid state program where I worked nights and graduated near the top. I specialized in real estate litigation and entity structuring, which meant I understood leases, LLCs, title disputes, and the kind of quiet contractual traps that people who think they are clever tend to fall into. My family called what I did Darcy's legal stuff the way you might refer to a hobby someone will eventually outgrow. But here is the part they never understood or never wanted to. 4 years earlier, Callahan Properties nearly went under. My father had over-leveraged on 2 new acquisitions, misread the insurance requirements on a flood-prone building, and gotten into a lease dispute with a tenant who happened to be a retired attorney with nothing but time and spite. The legal fees alone nearly drained the operating account. The bank flagged the credit line. 2 tenants in the flagship downtown building gave notice. My mother panicked but refused to show it. My father panicked and showed nothing else. I stepped in because I was 25 and still believed that saving your family was the same thing as earning your place in it. I restructured the LLC operating agreements, negotiated the tenant dispute down to a settlement that cost 1/3 of what their attorney had been quoting, refinanced the credit line under better terms by packaging the portfolio more intelligently, and personally handled the insurance claim that recovered nearly $140,000 my father had assumed was gone. I also created a new holding entity, Callahan Legacy Holdings, to protect the core properties from future liability exposure. My father signed everything I put in front of him. He understood almost none of it. What he understood was that the bleeding had stopped, and since he was the one standing in front of the business when it recovered, he told people he had turned things around through discipline and hard work. My mother told her friends the market had simply corrected itself. Vanessa told Marcus that Dad had handled a little bump in the road. Nobody mentioned me. Not once. Not publicly. Not privately. Not in passing. And I let it go because I thought the work spoke for itself. I thought eventually someone would look at what I had done and say, "Thank you, Darcy. We see you." 4 years later, I was still waiting, still showing up to holidays where I was seated at the edge, still answering calls at midnight when a tenant issue needed legal eyes, still reviewing contracts my father sent me with the subject line "quick favor," still watching Vanessa get praised for choosing the centerpiece for my mother's birthday, while I had spent the previous weekend restructuring a lease that saved the company $40,000 a year. Thanksgiving was not a surprise. It was a summary. Have you ever been the person in your family who holds everything together but gets treated like you are in the way? If you have, then you already know the specific kind of exhaustion I am describing. It is not anger exactly. It is the slow drain of realizing that your usefulness and your invisibility are the same thing to these people. After Thanksgiving, I did not yell. I did not cry in front of anyone. I drove home, sat on my kitchen floor for about 20 minutes, and then I did something I had never done before. I opened every file I had on Callahan Properties and Callahan Legacy Holdings, and I read them not as a daughter helping her family, but as an attorney reviewing the exposure of an ungrateful client. What I found was what I had always known, but never confronted. The holding entity that protected the core assets was in my name. I had structured it that way during the crisis, because my father's credit was compromised, and the bank required a guarantor with a clean financial profile. The operating agreements gave him management authority over day-to-day operations, but ownership of the entity, and therefore the underlying properties, was mine. He managed the buildings. I owned the ground they sat on. My father knew this in the way people know things they find inconvenient. He had signed the documents. He had nodded when I explained them. And then he had spent 4 years pretending the conversation never happened, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging me. I also held the personal guarantee on the company's primary credit line, the one that funded seasonal maintenance, tenant improvements, and new acquisitions. Without my guarantee, the bank had no obligation to extend. I had renewed it every year without being asked to, because I assumed that was what family did. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I called my attorney. Not the family's attorney, who was a golf buddy of my father's and about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. My attorney. A woman named Judith Dow, who had been my mentor in law school and who had exactly zero tolerance for sentimental nonsense dressed up as business. I told her what I wanted. She asked me if I was sure. I said I had never been more sure of anything. She said, "Good. Then let's make it clean." By Friday, the documents were ready. A formal notice of withdrawal of my personal guarantee on the credit line, effective in 30 days. A termination notice on the below-market management agreement that had allowed my father to operate the properties at terms so favorable they bordered on charity. A demand for an accounting of all revenue generated by the properties under Callahan Legacy Holdings for the prior 4 years. And a letter from Judith informing them that any future communication regarding business matters was to be directed to her office. I asked Judith to put the documents in a manila envelope with a handwritten note on the outside that said, "Something I forgot to mention at Thanksgiving." She looked at me over her glasses and almost smiled. Almost. The envelope arrived at my mother's real estate office at 9 a.m. on a Monday, because I knew she opened her own mail first thing, before the assistants arrived, while she drank her first coffee and reviewed the weekly schedule. I wanted her to be alone when she read it. I wanted the silence around her to be as complete as the silence she had given me at that dinner table. She was not alone for long. Within 20 minutes, she had called my father. Within 40, Vanessa was on the phone. By noon, I had 14 missed calls across 3 numbers and a text from Marcus that just said, "Darcy, what's going on?" I did not respond to any of them. My father left the first voicemail at 9:47 a.m. His voice was controlled but tight. "Darcy, I received something at your mother's office that I think was sent in error. Call me so we can sort this out." The second voicemail came 12 minutes later, and the control was gone. "This is completely unacceptable. You need to call me right now." The third was from my mother at 10:15, and it was the one that told me everything I needed to know about how they had always seen me. She said, "Darcy, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is not how we handle things in this family. You are embarrassing yourself. Not us. Not the family. Yourself." Even in crisis, she could not resist making it about my failure. Vanessa called at 10:30. She did not leave a voicemail. She sent a text instead. "Whatever point you're trying to make, it's pathetic. Dad built that company. You just pushed paper." I screenshotted the text and forwarded it to Judith. Not because it was legally relevant, but because I wanted someone else to see the sentence my family used to describe 4 years of saving them from ruin. By Tuesday afternoon, my father had apparently called the bank to confirm that my guarantee withdrawal was real. The loan officer, who had dealt primarily with me for the past 4 years, confirmed it was. My father then learned something he should have understood years ago. Without my guarantee, the bank had no obligation to maintain the credit facility at its current terms. They did not cancel it immediately. They did something worse from his perspective. They put it under review, which meant a freeze on any new draws until the review was completed. That meant no funding for the January maintenance cycle across 6 of the 14 properties. That meant deferred repairs, deferred tenant improvements, and very uncomfortable conversations with tenants who had been promised upgrades in their lease renewals. Within 3 days of receiving the envelope, my father showed up at my apartment. He brought my mother. They did not call ahead. I opened the door because I was expecting a delivery, and there they were, standing in my hallway like 2 people who had rehearsed a conversation but could not agree on who should start. My father went first. He said we needed to talk about this like adults, and that whatever misunderstanding had occurred at Thanksgiving could be resolved without involving lawyers. I leaned against my doorframe and asked him what misunderstanding he was referring to. He said the toast. My mother's toast. He said she had not meant to leave me out, that it had been an oversight, that she had been nervous about hosting and simply forgot. I asked my mother if that was true. She looked at me with the same expression she had used in the kitchen doorway, the polite blankness of someone who considers you furniture. She said, "Darcy, I can't remember every little thing I say at dinner." I asked her if she remembered telling me I blended into the background so well, it was almost a talent. Her face did not change, but her posture did. My father jumped in and said we were getting off track, that the real issue was the business, and that family matters should not be mixed with financial decisions. I almost laughed because that sentence contained more irony than he would ever be capable of recognizing. The entire business existed in its current form because I had mixed family with financial decisions. The only difference was that back then, the mixing had benefited him. I told them both that the documents were valid, the deadlines were real, and that Judith would be happy to discuss transition options during business hours. My father said I was being vindictive. My mother said I was being dramatic. I said I was being an owner, which was apparently a role none of them had ever assigned to me, even though they had signed the paperwork that made it legal. They left after 20 minutes. My mother did not say goodbye. My father stopped at the door and said something that landed harder than I expected. He said, "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you." I looked at him and said, "Grandpa is the one who taught me to read a contract before I signed it. Maybe he should have taught you the same thing." He left without closing the door. The next phase was predictable, because desperate people follow patterns. My father hired an attorney, not his golf buddy this time, but a real one, a commercial litigator from a mid-size firm downtown. They sent a letter claiming that the operating agreements I had drafted were ambiguous, and that my father had acquired equitable ownership of the properties through years of management, reinvestment, and personal labor. It was a creative argument. It was also wrong because I am the person who had drafted those agreements, and I do not draft ambiguous documents. What I did not expect was what came attached to the letter. A declaration from Vanessa claiming that she had been promised a 25% stake in the company by my father in 2021, and that my actions were interfering with her ownership rights. Attached to the declaration was a handwritten note on Callahan Properties letterhead, allegedly signed by my father, promising Vanessa a quarter of the business in recognition of her contributions to the family brand. Judith called me when she saw it. She read me the note over the phone and then said, "The letterhead is from 2019. The ink analysis will probably show this was written sometime in the last 2 weeks. Do you want me to request forensic examination?" I sat in my office chair and pressed my fingers against my temples for a long time. I was not surprised they had lied. I was sad that they had lied badly. There is something uniquely painful about watching your family commit fraud on your behalf and not even have the skill to make it convincing. We responded with a counterfiling that included the complete chain of title, the original operating agreements with notarized signatures, the bank records showing my guarantee as the sole credit support, the insurance recovery I had personally handled, and a timeline showing every emergency I had resolved over 4 years, with corresponding email threads and wire transfer confirmations. We also requested preservation of all documents and flagged the suspicious declaration for potential referral. Their attorney called Judith 2 days later and asked if there was room for a conversation. Judith said there was always room for a conversation that began with an accurate understanding of the facts. The mediation happened 3 weeks later, in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building I technically owned, which was a detail I did not mention out loud, but appreciated privately. My father came in a blazer and khakis, looking like a man preparing to be reasonable. My mother wore her real estate broker smile, the one designed to make strangers trust her. Vanessa showed up 40 minutes late with sunglasses on indoors and said she did not see why she had to be here, because this was between me and Dad. Marcus did not come. I later learned he had told Vanessa he did not want any involvement in what he called a situation that should have been handled with a simple thank you 3 years ago. I liked Marcus a little more after hearing that. My father's attorney presented a proposal. They wanted a 2-4-month transition period, during which my father would continue operating the properties under existing terms. They wanted the credit line guarantee reinstated. They wanted Vanessa's alleged ownership interest recognized. And in exchange, my father was prepared to issue a formal acknowledgement of my contributions to the business, delivered privately, and to include me in future family events in a more visible role. A more visible role. As if being recognized by my own family was a concession they were generously negotiating. As if my existence at their dinner table was a bargaining chip they could trade for 2 more years of free rent. I said no. My father started to respond. And I said no again, not louder, just flatter. I told them my counteroffer was simple. They had 60 days to vacate the managed properties and transition to independent operations. The brand name Callahan Properties could continue to be used for the management business only, not attached to any property I owned. The fraudulent declaration would be withdrawn formally and in writing, or I would refer it independently. There would be no private letter of acknowledgement because I was not interested in being thanked in a whisper by people who had insulted me at full volume. Vanessa took off her sunglasses. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, and what she saw confused her. She said, "When did you become this person?" I said, "Around the same time you decided I wasn't one." The mediation ended without agreement, which meant it went to a hearing. The hearing was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no shouting, no gasps, no last-minute revelations delivered by a witness bursting through the door. It was paperwork and questions, and the slow, grinding machinery of fact versus fiction. My father was asked when he had first learned that the holding entity was in my name. He said he had always understood it to be a temporary arrangement. Judith asked him to identify any document, email, or written communication in which a temporary arrangement was discussed. He could not. He was asked whether he had ever paid market rate rent for any of the properties he managed. He started explaining how family arrangements work. The judge asked for numbers. He did not have any. Vanessa's declaration was addressed briefly and devastatingly. Judith presented metadata showing the document had been created on a laptop registered to Vanessa's home network, 11 days after Thanksgiving, using a word processing template that did not exist in 2021. Vanessa's attorney attempted to explain it as a reconstructed memorandum of an oral agreement. Judith asked if the reconstructed memorandum routinely included simulated signatures from people who were not present. No one answered. My mother was not called to testify. She sat in the back of the room with her hands folded and her face locked in the expression of a woman who had always believed presentation was the same thing as truth and was now watching that belief get disassembled in public under fluorescent lights. The ruling came 10 days later. Title confirmed in my holding entity. Management agreements terminated. Credit guarantee withdrawal upheld. The fraudulent declaration was referred for further examination, though I ultimately chose not to pursue it. Not out of mercy, but because the point had been made, and some forms of punishment are more effective when they live as a threat rather than a consequence. The 60 days that followed were the loudest my family had ever been about me. My mother called extended relatives and told them I had been brainwashed by a predatory attorney. My father told business associates that I had experienced a mental health crisis and was acting erratically. Vanessa posted veiled quotes on her social media about toxic women who destroy families for attention, which was ironic given that her entire online presence had been built on a family she had never bothered to understand the mechanics of. But the buildings did not care about narrative. The buildings cared about maintenance schedules, lease renewals, insurance payments, and a property manager who actually understood the portfolio. I hired one. A quiet, competent woman named Rosa, who had managed commercial properties in Savannah for 15 years, and who asked me exactly one personal question during her interview. Is the family going to be a problem? I said no. She said good. My father moved his management operation to a smaller office outside the historic district. He kept a handful of clients, mostly people who had known him for decades, and felt loyal to the name. My mother's social calendar contracted sharply once people realized the properties she had casually referenced as family assets were no longer connected to her family. Vanessa and Marcus separated 4 months later. I do not know whether my situation was the cause, but I know that Marcus had started asking questions after mediation that Vanessa could not answer without admitting she had been performing a version of the family that did not exist. My father wrote me one letter, 6 months after the hearing. It was 3 pages long. In it, he said I had dismantled everything he had spent his life building. He said he hoped I was proud of myself. He said he had given me every opportunity and that I had repaid him with cruelty. He did not mention Thanksgiving. He did not mention the toast. He did not mention the 4 years of midnight calls and emergency rescues and unsigned gratitude. He did not mention the forged declaration. He wrote 3 pages about his pain, and not a single sentence about mine. I read it once. I folded it. I put it in a drawer. Some letters do not deserve replies. They deserve filing. People in Charleston talked, of course. Some said I was ruthless. Some said my father had always been a man who confused owning things with earning them. Some said there had to be more to the story, because nobody tears apart a family over a Thanksgiving toast. That last group always missed the point. It was never about the toast. It was about years of being the engine inside a machine that only acknowledged the hood ornament. It was about being necessary enough to use, and invisible enough to mock, and compliant enough to never challenge the arrangement. The toast was not the wound. It was the moment I stopped pretending the wound was not there. I built a new practice the following spring. Small, focused, deliberate. I handle real estate disputes and entity restructuring for family-held businesses, which turns out to be the kind of work that never runs dry, because families are remarkably good at confusing love with leverage and loyalty with silence. My clients are usually the person in the family who did the most and got recognized the least. I understand them in ways most attorneys cannot, because I have sat where they are sitting, and I know exactly what it costs to finally stand up. On the wall behind my desk, in a simple wooden frame, I keep a printed copy of my mother's Thanksgiving seating chart. I am listed at the bottom, between a cousin's +1 and the empty chair. Clients sometimes notice it and ask what it is. I tell them it is a reminder. Of what, they ask. Of what happens when people confuse silence with agreement. Do I feel guilty? No. I feel grief sometimes, the particular kind that comes from knowing your family chose performance over love, and that no amount of evidence or competence or loyalty was ever going to change the casting. I feel the ache of holidays I no longer attend and phone calls I no longer make, and a mother whose voice I can still hear telling me I blend into the background. But guilt requires believing you did something wrong, and the only thing I did wrong was wait as long as I did. My father still manages a few properties on the edge of town. My mother still hosts dinner parties, smaller now, with fewer guests who matter. Vanessa moved to Atlanta after the divorce and started a lifestyle brand that has 1,200 followers and a bio that says rebuilding with grace, which is a phrase that means different things depending on which side of the table you were sitting on. And me? I am here. Visible. Solvent. Named on every document that matters. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally stopped volunteering for a role that was designed to keep me small. If I have learned anything, it is this. Being needed is not the same thing as being valued. Being present is not the same thing as being seen. And being family is not permission to treat someone like they do not exist, simply because they have always been too loyal to leave. They spent years acting as if I were not in the room. In the end, they were right about one thing. I was never meant to stay in a room where my own name could not be spoken out loud. So I built my own. And the door is mine to open.